Lonely cowboy. Rode in to buy a horse, but found a mother and her 3 kids in the barn. The God-forsaken town of Last Hope was a whisper in a land that screamed desolation, a place radiating quiet desperation, simmering regret, and a weary cruelty. Cain wasn't there for trouble. He was just a ghost looking for a fresh horse to carry him deeper into nowhere. He moved with the rigid stillness of a man who had made a covenant with silence, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated stable. The fire hadn't just taken his family, it had burned away his soul, leaving a brand of guilt he could never outrun. He was drawn to a wild-eyed mare, another broken spirit that understood the pull of the horizon. But then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A child's cough, thin and desperate from the shadows of the next stall. He came to this bone orchard of a town to flee his past. But what happens when a new one finds you alive and breathing and begs you to fight? The answer would cost him more than just bullets. Before we begin, let me know where that wind has carried this one. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. All right now, lean in close. This one starts in a town that had nearly given up on hope. The town of Last Hope was a whisper in a land that screamed desolation. It was a place that had surrendered its handful of buildings, slumping into the dust like weary shoulders. The sun was a hammer beating the merciless expanse of the plains into a shimmering haze. The air, thick with a gritty heat, tasted of rust and endings. For Cain, it tasted of smoke. Always the smoke. He rode in on a horse as tired as his soul, a man who wore the silence of the prairies like a second skin. He moved with the rigid stillness of a man haunted not by what was to come, but by all that was already gone. His eyes, the color of a storm-clouded sky, didn't just see the ramshackle saloon or the sun-bleached mercantile. They saw the specter of flames licking at the edges of his vision, the ghost of a world turned to ash. He wasn't here for redemption. A man like Cain knew some sins leave a brand too deep to ever fade. He was here for a horse, a simple transaction. A horse was 4 legs to carry a man's body away when his own 2 couldn't run fast enough from his soul. The livery smelled of dry rot, old sweat, and the faint acidic tang of fear. An old man with a face like a dried creek bed eyed him from a tilted chair. "Looking for a mount?" Cain said, his voice a low gravel rough from disuse. The old man spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the dust. "Ain't we all? Looking for something." A fresh start, a quick exit. He squinted his gaze, probing. "This ain't a place for new beginnings, stranger. It's a place for endings." Cain ignored the man's attempt at prophecy. His attention had been caught. In the last stall, separate from the others, stood a creature of midnight and fury. An ink-black mare, her coat sleek over muscles that trembled with contained power. Her eyes held a storm, a wildness that hadn't been broken, only beaten. A brand on her flank was a jagged, ugly scar, a mark of cruel ownership. She tossed her head, a snort of defiance rattling the hot, still air. He knew that kind of fight. The fight to keep a broken thing from shattering completely. He walked towards her stall, the floorboards groaning under his weight, his footsteps the only sound besides the buzzing of flies. He reached a hand towards the rough-hewn wood of her gate, a silent question passing between man and beast. That's when he heard it. It wasn't the wet, chesty cough of a sick man. It was smaller, drier. A sound trying to smother itself in the hay, a desperate little flutter of life in a place that reeked of decay. He froze. Trouble was a magnet, and Cain had been running from its pull for 3 long years. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around to buy the mare to ride until the sun set and rose a dozen times. To leave the sound behind, it ain't your concern. The words were a familiar prayer, a litany of survival. But the sound came again, followed by a faint, shushing whisper, a mother's whisper, the sound of his own personal damnation. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner. He turned from the mare, his boots slow, heavy. He moved towards the adjacent stall, the one that was supposed to be empty, the one bolted from the outside. The hinges groaned as he slid the heavy iron lock. The sound was deafening in the silence. He pushed the door. Darkness answered. Then his eyes adjusted. It was a nest of limbs and fear huddled in the far corner. A woman, her face pale and smudged with dirt but her spine ramrod straight, held a broken pitchfork in her white-knuckled hands. Behind her, 2 small children peered out, their eyes wide and dark. A third, a small boy, was wrapped in her arms, his body trembling with the effort of each rattling breath. "Get back," the woman's voice was a splinter of ice, fierce and brittle. Cain didn't move. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply stood there, a large, quiet shadow in the doorway, and raised his hands, palms open. It was the universal sign for peace, but for him, it felt like surrender. The image burned, superimposed over another. A different woman, a different child, smoke and shadows where this hay and dust now stood. He could smell the burning pine, could feel the heat on his skin, could hear the name that was a constant scream in the quiet of his mind. Sarah. The woman in the stall was not Sarah, but her eyes held the same feral-cornered terror of a she-wolf defending her cubs to the last. She was a living echo of the ghost that rode on his shoulder, a ghost that whispered his failure with every beat of his heart. He had come to this town to buy a horse and ride away. But the past he'd been running from had finally cornered him, wearing a new face and asking a question his soul could not answer. Would he run this time? The air in the stall was a thick, suffocating blanket of dust and fear. Cain stood his ground in the doorway, a sentinel carved from granite, and regret his hands still raised. Rowan's grip on the broken pitchfork did not waver, her knuckles white mountains on a desolate landscape. Behind her, the oldest boy, Leo, she would later call him, put a protective arm in front of his sister. Cain slowly, deliberately lowered his hands. He unhooked the battered canteen from his hip and the small leather pouch of dried jerky. He said nothing. Words were treacherous things, promises waiting to be broken. An offering was simpler, cleaner. He set them on the dusty floor just inside the stall and took 2 steps back into the main stable aisle, his movements slow, unthreatening. The children's eyes were fixed on the canteen. The youngest, the sick one, coughed again, a dry, weak sound that scraped at the silence. "Ma," the boy, Leo whispered, his voice cracking. "We're thirsty." Rowan's gaze flickered from Cain's impassive face to the offerings on the ground, a war playing out in the depths of her tired eyes. Suspicion fought a desperate battle against a mother's need. Need won. "Leave it," she commanded, her voice still sharp, but the icy edge had thawed just a fraction. "And back away." Cain complied, melting into the deeper shadows of the stable, his back against the rough wood of the opposite stall. He watched as Rowan cautiously allowed Leo to scurry forward and retrieve the items. He watched as she uncorked the canteen and gave each child a small precious sip before taking one herself. It was in that moment, watching the simple sacred act of a mother providing for her young, that the ghosts behind Cain's eyes began to stir restlessly. When the children were quieted by the food, Rowan finally spoke, her story tumbling out in a low, urgent whisper. They were fleeing Rorik. The name was unfamiliar to Cain, but the way she said it, like a curse, like a prayer to a dark god, told him everything he needed to know. Rorik was her husband's brother, a man who had claimed their farmstead after her husband's accident. A fall from a horse. An accident no one in the territory dared question. He is a man who thinks the world owes him tribute. Rowan explained, her eyes dark with memory. He believes he's a king from some cold, forgotten land, and that we are merely his property now. Her hands tightened into fists. He doesn't want a wife. He wants a dynasty. And my son, my Leo, is the heir he means to control. Cain listened, his face a stone mask. This was a story as old as the dust under his boots, a story of greed, of power, of a strong man preying on the weak. It was the story of the West. It was a story he wanted no part of. This was not his cross to bear. The ghosts on his shoulders were heavy enough. "You need to keep moving," he said, his voice flat. It was advice, not an offer, a way to draw a line. "He'll find you here." "We have nowhere else to go," she whispered, her fierce pride crumbling into desperation. "This stable, this was the last prayer we had." Cain felt the trap closing. He could feel the phantom weight of a small hand in his, the echo of a little girl's laughter. Lily. The name was a fresh wound. He hardened his jaw, forcing the memory down. "I'm not a hero, ma'am." He said the words, tasting like ash. "The world broke me of that notion a long time ago." He was about to turn to walk away, to force himself to leave them to their fate, when a new sound reached them. The rhythmic, arrogant beat of multiple horses riding into town. It wasn't the sound of weary travelers. It was the sound of ownership. Through a grimy crack in the stable wall, Cain saw them. A half-dozen riders led by a bear of a man on a war horse that was more beast than steed. The man was immense, with a beard the color of dried blood and eyes like chips of winter ice. He was a man built for the cold north, a walking slab of granite and iron will, whose very presence seemed to leach the warmth from the air. The townsfolk of Last Hope vanished. Doors closed, shutters were drawn. The silence in the town shifted from weary to watchful, from tired to terrified. This had to be Rorik. He and his men dismounted, their spurs jingling a deathly tune. They strode towards the livery, and Cain's blood ran cold. He was trapped. The past had him in a vice. The present was about to spring the jaws. Rorik kicked open the livery door and grabbed the old stable owner by the collar. The woman Rorik's voice was a low, guttural rumble, an avalanche in the making. And her litter! Where are they? The old man's face went pale. Ain't seen no woman, Mr. Rorik. Swear on my mother's grave." Rorik's cold eyes scanned the dark, dusty stable. He didn't believe it. He shoved the old man aside. "Tear it apart," he commanded his men. "Every stall." Cain's hand fell to the worn leather grip of his Colt. In the stall, Rowan gathered her children, her body a shield. Their eyes met across the shadows, a shared, silent understanding of doom. The heavy, measured footsteps of Rorik's men began to echo on the wooden floorboards. Closer. A nearby stall door was kicked open with a splintering crack. Closer. A shadow fell over the bolt on their door. A thick, gloved hand reached for the lock. The bolt screeched a sound of finality. Cain didn't think. He acted. A ghost of a plan born of desperation and the wild terror in a mare's eyes took hold. He lunged not for his gun, but for the stall beside him. A slice of his knife. The rope tying the black mare fell away. A hard slap on the mare's flank, a low growl in his throat. Go! The world exploded. The mare, a creature of coiled fury, burst from her prison. She was a black thunderbolt, a screaming, kicking storm of hoof and muscle. Rorik's men, caught completely by surprise, shouted and dove for cover as the horse galloped through the aisle, a living battering ram. The chaos was a beautiful, terrifying symphony. In that precious, violent moment, Cain moved. His hand clamped on Rowan's arm, not a request, but an anchor. Now he snarled, pulling her and the huddle of children from the stall. They slipped through the pandemonium ghosts in a whirlwind of dust and panic. As they fled towards a broken planked wall at the back of the stable, Cain caught the eye of the old stable owner. The man was pressed against a support beam watching. He met Cain's gaze for a fraction of a second and, with a barely perceptible motion, jerked his chin towards a dark, overgrown path behind the building. As Cain and Rowan's family disappeared into the brush, they heard Rorik's enraged bellow from inside. "Which way?" The old man's weary voice floated after them. Rode out the main gate, Mr. Rorik, headed north, hard. It was a lie, a small, brave, suicidal lie. It might buy them minutes. In this land, minutes were a lifetime. They plunged into the Badlands, a world bleached of color and hope. The cool darkness of the stable was a forgotten dream, replaced by a blinding, merciless sun. The land stretched before them, a canvas of cracked earth and jagged teeth of rock under a sky that was a vault of indifferent blue. There was nowhere to hide. The journey was a silent, brutal pilgrimage. The sick boy Sam grew heavier in Kane's arms with every step. The small, feverish weight against his chest was a ghost of a memory. He could not shrug off a phantom ache that twisted his gut. Rowan's daughter Cora stumbled often, her face smudged with tears she was too frightened to shed. Leo, the oldest, walked with a grim-faced determination, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a boy forced to become a man in the space of a single sunrise. Hours bled together. Their world shrank to the sound of their own ragged breathing and the crunch of their boots on the unforgiving ground. Kane, a master of survival, found a shallow arroyo that offered a sliver of shade. They collapsed there, their bodies screaming for rest. As twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, Kane returned from a short foray with 2 scrawny rabbits. He gutted them with practiced efficiency, the knife a familiar extension of his hand. He built a small, nearly smokeless fire in a hollow between the rocks, a fragile circle of warmth in the vast, encroaching cold. Rowan, to his surprise, had not been idle. She had gathered a handful of bitter-looking weeds. Willow bark, she said, noticing his glance as she boiled them in their single tin cup. For the fever. She knew the land. Another piece of her story told without words. They ate in silence, the meager meal a sacrament. Kane gave the largest portion of the roasted meat to Leo. Later, as the children finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep huddled together, he took off his own worn blanket and draped it over Rowan and her brood. She was watching him, her eyes reflecting the fire's light. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were small, but they carried an immense weight. Kane just nodded, staring into the flames. He felt her gaze on him, a question she hadn't yet asked. "You know this land well," she observed softly. He shrugged, poking the fire with a stick. "I know how to get lost in it." He looked at them, then truly looked. The way Rowan's hand rested on her son's brow, the fierce protective set of Leo's shoulders even in sleep. They were not ghosts. They were terribly, dangerously real. And for the first time in years, the crushing loneliness in his chest receded, replaced by a different feeling. A sharp, terrifying feeling of responsibility. It was in that quiet moment of connection that he saw it. Far out on the horizon, on the crest of a dark mesa, a pinprick of light flashed. Once, twice. It wasn't a star. It was the sun glinting off a spyglass. His blood ran cold. He rose silently, moving to the edge of their shallow shelter, his body instantly alert. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed. And then he saw them. 3 riders silhouetted against the last of the dying light. They weren't riding aimlessly. They were moving with the slow, patient, methodical purpose of wolves. The fire that had offered them a moment's peace had also been their betrayal, a column of smoke for a predator's eye. They were no longer running. They were being hunted. There was no time for words, only the desperate, burning need for survival. Kane grabbed the boy Sam from Rowan's arms, his own movements a blur of grim instinct. "Run!" he commanded, his voice a raw tear in the fabric of the afternoon. They ran. Deeper into the Badlands, a maze of stone and shadow that offered no sanctuary, only a change of scenery for their demise. The pursuit was relentless. The sound of hooves was a drumbeat counting down the last seconds of their lives. Kane could feel Rorik's cold, triumphant gaze on his back, a physical weight. Ahead, the earth split open. A canyon, a deep and narrow throat of rock carved by a long-dead river, offered the only path. It was a fool's gambit, a rabbit running into a snare, but it was the only gambit they had. They scrambled down the treacherous scree slope, stones scattering under their feet, and plunged into the canyon's cool, oppressive shadow. The walls rose on either side, sheer and impassable, the rock stained with the rust-red tears of ancient rains. They found a shallow wound in the rock face, a cave that was little more than an overhang, smelling of damp stone and finality. Here they huddled, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Above them, on the canyon rim, the riders appeared. Rorik dismounted a dark king, surveying his trapped quarry. He did not charge. He did not shout. He simply began to make camp. The confidence in the act was more terrifying than any threat. He would wait them out. He would let the sun, the thirst, and the silence do his work for him. The waiting was a poison of its own. Hours stretched into an eternity. The sun crept across the sky, dragging their shadows across the canyon floor. The world shrank to the size of their dusty stone prison. And the boy was getting worse. Sam's breathing was a brittle, shallow rhythm, each inhale a tiny, rasping struggle. The willowbark tea Rowan had made was no longer enough. His skin was hot to the touch, his small body radiating a fever that seemed to consume the very air around him. Rowan held him, humming a low, wordless lullaby that was more a prayer than a song. Her face was a mask of fierce, fragile hope, a sight that pierced Kane more deeply than any bullet ever could. The fire they'd managed to start was a pathetic flicker against the encroaching darkness. The silence in the cave was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghosts he had dragged in with him. Rowan looked up from her son, her eyes finding Kane's in the dim, flickering light. "You've seen this kind of fever before," she stated. It was not a question. The words unlocked something in him, a door he had kept bolted for 1,000 nights. He looked at the child, at the mother, at the finality of the stone walls around them. The running was over. My daughter." He began the words like pulling shards of glass from his throat. He had not spoken her name aloud in 3 years. Lily. The name hung in the air, a fragile, beautiful, terrible thing. She was 4 years old, all fire and sunlight. He stared into the dying embers, but he was seeing a different fire. There was a sickness. The doctor said it was just a cough. I had a chance at a cattle drive, a long one. Good money. I told Sarah, my wife, I'd be back before the first snow. I promised. He swallowed the sound raw in the quiet cave. The money was good. Too good. I stayed on for an extra week, for a handful of silver. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and empty, as if he could still feel the phantom weight of those coins. The snow came early that year, a blizzard. By the time I made it back, there was nothing left, just a chimney standing like a tombstone in the snow. The fire, it took them both. He finally looked at Rowan, his eyes a raw, open wound. The fever didn't kill my Lily. He whispered the confession, a poison he had held in for too long. I did. I wasn't there. The silence that followed was profound. Rowan didn't offer empty comforts. She didn't say, "It wasn't your fault." She simply watched him, her gaze filled with an ancient, sorrowful understanding. She reached out, not to touch him, but as if to hold the space between them, to honor the weight of his confession. "So, you have been carrying their ghosts," she said softly. Her voice was not one of pity. It was one of recognition. Grief isn't a cage to lock yourself in, Kane. It can be a fire. It can keep you warm, or it can forge you into something stronger. Her words, so simple and true, struck him with the force of a physical blow. In all his years of running, no one had ever spoken to him of fire as anything but destruction. A sharp, commanding shout from the canyon entrance shattered the moment. Rorik's voice. Enough waiting. Kane scrambled to the mouth of the cave. Outside, the darkness was coming alive. Torches were being lit, their flames casting long, monstrous shadows that danced and writhed along the canyon walls. Rorik and his men were advancing. The time for confessions was over. The time for absolution had run out. Outside, the sound of heavy boots crunched on stone growing closer. The wolves were coming into the dark. The torchlight danced, casting long, predatory shadows that writhed like serpents on the canyon walls. Rorik's men were advancing a slow, confident tide of violence. Inside the cave, the world had shrunk to the space of a single heartbeat. Cain looked at Rowan, at the children huddled behind her, and the fire he had carried in his gut for 3 years, the fire of guilt, finally found its purpose. It was no longer a thing of destruction. It was fuel. This time he would be there. He checked his Colt, the worn metal cool and solid in his hand. 6 bullets, 6 chances to buy them a few more minutes of life. He turned to Rowan, his voice low and devoid of any tremor. "The small pistol I gave you, keep their heads down. Don't stop until it's empty." He was ready to step into the night, a final defiant act in a life defined by running away. A good death, a meaningful death. No, the word was not a plea. It was a command. Rowan stood up, stepping between him and the mouth of the cave. The firelight caught the fierce, unyielding glint in her eyes. The terror was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty that mirrored the stone around them. "You think a gun is the only weapon in this canyon?" she asked, her voice a low, powerful hum. "This is my land, Cain. My home. Rorik thinks he owns it, but he has never listened to it. He doesn't hear the way the wind whispers through that pass or know how the rains have weakened the rock." She pointed up towards the high, jagged cliffs that were barely visible against the star-dusted sky. "Up there," she said, "on the east wall, there is a section of loose rock, a whole cliff face held in place by a single pillar of stone. A keystone. My father showed it to me when I was a girl. He called it the mountain's breath. One good push, and it would all come down." Cain stared at her, then up at the dark, inscrutable cliffs. It was a prayer, not a plan, a desperate gamble on shifting stone. But he saw no desperation in her eyes. He saw strategy. He saw the heart of a survivor who fought with the weapons she had: knowledge, courage, and a deep abiding connection to the earth he had only ever seen as an enemy. "You will make the noise," she commanded, her plan taking shape in the flickering darkness. "Draw their fire. Draw all of it. Give me and Leo time to climb the back trail." He looked from her determined face to the sleeping form of her oldest son. It was madness. How much time, he asked the question, in acceptance? An act of faith. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Until you hear the mountains speak." He broke from the cave like a man possessed. A blur of motion in the torchlight. The first shot was a prayer, the second a promise. He didn't aim to kill, not yet. He aimed to enrage. Bullets sparked off the canyon wall to his left, then his right, a chaotic dance of ricochets that sent Rorik's men scrambling for cover. "He's over there, the east wall," a man shouted. Cain moved with a lethal grace, a shadow flitting between boulders, making himself a larger threat than one man had any right to be. The canyon erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the bullets chipping stone teeth from the rock around him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw 2 smaller shadows break from the cave and begin a desperate scramble up a nearly invisible path on the opposite cliff face. Rowan and Leo. The sight sent a surge of adrenaline through him, cold and pure. He fought with a new ferocity, his shots now finding their mark, forcing Rorik's men to keep their heads down, their eyes fixed on him, the decoy. The bait in the trap. He's just one man. Rorik roared, his frustration echoing through the canyon. "Spread out. Find the woman. Where is the woman? Too late." Cain saw them. 2 small figures silhouetted against the night sky, straining against a great dark pillar of rock. He held his breath, firing his last 2 shots to draw one final volley of fire towards himself. It started not with a roar, but with a low, deep groan, a sound from the belly of the earth. A vibration he felt in his bones before he heard it. The gunfire stopped. Every man, including Rorik, looked up. The mountain was speaking. The groan became a crack, then a grinding, shattering scream as the keystone gave way. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the world tilted. The entire cliff face, 100 tons of rock and earth held in check for 1,000 years, sighed and began to move. It did not fall. It lunged. A river of stone, a thundering, unstoppable avalanche poured into the narrow canyon. It wasn't aimed at the men. It was aimed at the path itself. Boulders the size of horses crashed down, obliterating the ground where they had just stood. The sound a deafening final roar that swallowed every scream. The dust cloud that billowed up was thick and choking, blotting out the stars. The silence that followed was more profound than the noise it replaced. It was the silence of a world remade. When the dust began to settle, Cain saw the result. The path was gone, replaced by a massive, impassable wall of fresh fallen rock. On the other side he could hear Rorik screaming his name, a litany of pure, impotent rage. He was a caged wolf, his power shattered, his path blocked. He was alive, but he was beaten. Cain slowly lowered his empty Colt, his chest heaving. He looked up. On the ridge, 2 figures stood, their small forms outlined against the first faint hint of dawn. Rowan and her son looking down not at the destruction, but at him. The battle for the canyon was over. He had not been their savior. He had merely been the diversion for a woman fighting her own war on her own terms. Dawn broke over the canyon not with a roar, but with a soft, forgiving light that painted the newly scarred rock in hues of rose and gold. Below in the gloom, Rorik's curses echoed the impotent rage of a king, dethroned, his voice already growing hoarse. Cain didn't look back. There was no victory in watching a caged animal tear at its bars. Justice in this wild country was often just a matter of walking away, of leaving a man to the prison he had built for himself. Slowly, carefully, Rowan and Leo made their way down the rock face. When Rowan reached the canyon floor, her feet landing softly on the dusty ground, her eyes met Cain's. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a quiet, steely strength. He saw her then, not as the frightened woman from the stable, but as the mountain itself, unmovable, ancient, and powerful, in ways he had never understood. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cain looked at the wall of rock that sealed the canyon, then back at her. "He's trapped," he said. "That's enough." She nodded. Then her gaze fell to the gash on his arm, a dark, angry line from a ricocheting bullet. Wordlessly, she tore a strip from the hem of her worn dress and began to clean the wound with water from his canteen. Her touch was gentle but firm, an act of mending that went far deeper than the skin. In that moment, surrounded by the dust and silence of their battle, he wasn't a killer, and she wasn't a victim. They were simply 2 survivors tending to the wounds of the world. The journey that followed was different. The land was no longer a barren enemy to be outrun, but a provider to be understood. Rowan taught him which roots held water, which leaves could soothe a fever. She moved through the landscape not as a fugitive, but as a daughter of the earth reading its subtle language. In turn, Cain hunted with a silent efficiency, providing for them his skills, no longer a tool for a lonely existence, but for the preservation of this fragile, burgeoning pack. They walked side by side, a silent partnership forged in fire and stone. On the 3rd day, Sam's fever broke. Cain watched as Rowan held a cool, damp cloth to the boy's forehead, his breathing finally easing from a ragged rasp into the deep, even rhythm of sleep. A faint pink returned to his cheeks. Cain felt a profound sense of release, a quiet gratitude that was entirely new to him. He was not their savior. He was merely a witness to their resilience. A week later, they crested a high ridge and the world changed. The angry red and brown of the Badlands gave way to a sweeping valley, a slash of impossible green carved by a meandering river. It was a valley that held the color green like a secret promise. Nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees was a cabin. It was a skeleton of a dream. A collapsed porch, a roof open to the sky in places, but it had 4 walls and a solid stone hearth. It was a foundation. Weeks turned into a season. The sound of Cain's hammer replaced the echo of gunfire. He rebuilt the porch, reshingled the roof, his hands finding a new purpose in building instead of breaking. Rowan, with the children's help, cleared a patch of land for a garden, her fingers coaxing life from the rich soil. The wild mare, which Cain had named Rowan's Shadow, grazed peacefully in a newly fenced pasture, her storms finally quieted. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Cain was setting the last post for the new corral. Rowan approached, carrying a tin cup of cool water. "The fence is strong," she said, her eyes on his work. He took the cup, their fingers brushing. The brief touch was a jolt, a current of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. He looked from the fence to her, to the cabin where a soft lantern glow was blooming in the window, to the children whose faint laughter carried on the evening breeze. "We'll make it stronger," he said. He wasn't talking about the fence. Later that night, he stood on the porch looking out at the vast, star-dusted sky. The ghosts of Sarah and Lily were still there. They always would be. But they were no longer screaming specters in a house of fire. They were quiet companions, constellations in the night of his memory. The brand on his soul had not vanished. It had changed shape. It looked, he thought, a little like a home.